My body used to be a fortress. Every muscle was a stone, carefully placed and hardened through years of discipline. My heart was a metronome, steady and strong, capable of pushing through any pain. I saw my physical self as a direct reflection of my will. I was in control. Now this body is a ruin. There's a constant, low-grade tremor in my hands, a souvenir from the anxiety that rewired my nervous system. There's a dull ache behind my ribs that the doctors say is the ghost of a stomach ulcer, a reminder of the acid I brewed from stress and black coffee. I used to be able to deadlift more than 3 times my body weight. Now some mornings, the effort of just getting out of bed feels like a max-out lift. The irony is so thick I could choke on it. I built a temple to health, a place called Synergy Fitness, and in the process, I sacrificed my own body on its altar. The dream didn't start with spreadsheets or market analysis. It started with a feeling. The feeling of the cold, knurled steel of a barbell in my hands, the world narrowing to just me and the weight. It was my therapy, my church. I had a decent job, a cubicle in a gray building where I clicked a mouse and typed on a keyboard, moving numbers from one column to another. My soul was slowly dying under the fluorescent lights. The only time I felt alive was in the gym. I saw other people there going through the motions, lost in a sea of machines they didn't understand, with no guidance, no community. I knew I could do better. I envisioned a place that was more than just a room full of equipment. It would be a hub, a center for total wellness. Not just lifting, but nutrition, coaching, mobility work, a community of people genuinely supporting each other. Synergy. The name felt right. It was about bringing all the pieces of a healthy life together. My wife was cautious. She's a practical woman, a planner. She saw the dream in my eyes, but she also saw the numbers in our bank account. We had some savings, a small investment portfolio we were building for the kids' future, and the equity in our home. To her, this was our safety net, our insurance against the uncertainties of life. To me, it was seed money. I created a presentation, a pitch. I talked about passive income, about building a legacy. I used all the right words. I sold her on the dream, just like I sold myself. The initial investment was everything we had, every last penny. We signed a commercial lease on a building that was too big, took out a small business loan that felt like a millstone around my neck, and plunged into debt to buy the best equipment. The day I signed those loan documents, my hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was from adrenaline. I had no real risk management plan beyond the simple, foolish belief that I would not fail. I believed that my passion was enough, that my work ethic would conquer all. The first 6 months were a blur of manic energy. I was the contractor, the painter, the janitor, the CEO. I worked 20-hour days, fueled by caffeine and the sheer force of my will. I'd come home long after my wife and kids were asleep, my body aching, my clothes covered in dust and paint, and I'd feel a profound sense of satisfaction. I was building something real, something tangible. When we finally opened the doors, it felt like a triumph. People came. They loved the space, the equipment, the atmosphere. I was in my element. I was the high priest of my own temple, guiding people, helping them, watching them transform. I was living my dream, but a dream has to be paid for, not just with money, but with life force. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. I taught the morning boot camp classes at 5 a.m., did personal training sessions all day, managed the staff, cleaned the bathrooms at night, and then went home to work on the finances. I barely saw my family. Dinner became a plate she'd leave for me in the microwave. Conversations became a series of text messages. I was so consumed by the business that the world outside its 4 walls began to fade away. My health was the first thing I sacrificed. I stopped training for myself. Who had the time? My diet consisted of protein bars, energy drinks, and whatever I could grab in the 5 minutes between clients. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I told myself it was temporary. The hustle phase. I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor. It was proof of my dedication. The first signs that my body was breaking down were subtle. A persistent heartburn, a headache that would linger for days, a strange, fluttering feeling in my chest that I dismissed as too much caffeine. I was a fitness professional. I was supposed to be invincible. To admit that I was struggling, that the stress was getting to me, felt like a betrayal of the very principles I was selling to my members. So I ignored the signals. I pushed through the pain. I told myself that weakness was a choice. The gym was moderately successful, but it was a constant battle. The profit margins were razor thin. A piece of equipment would break, a pipe would leak, a slow month of membership sales would happen, and we'd be plunged into a financial crisis. The stress wasn't a series of peaks and valleys. It was a high, sustained plateau. It was a constant, grinding pressure that never, ever let up. I was living on a knife's edge, and the drop was a long way down. I started to resent the very people I was trying to help. A member complaining about the music being too loud would send me into an internal rage. A canceled membership felt like a personal betrayal. The joy was gone, replaced by a gnawing, desperate anxiety. My dream was becoming a nightmare, and I was chained to it, forced to watch it slowly curdle and die. And with it, a part of me was dying too. My body, my fortress, was beginning to crumble from the inside out, and I was too proud, too stubborn, and too terrified to do a single thing about it. The second year of Synergy Fitness was a slow, grinding war of attrition. The initial excitement had worn off, both for me and for the members. The reality had set in. Running a gym was less about inspiring transformations and more about chasing down late payments and fixing broken toilets. The financial pressure became my shadow, a constant companion that whispered reminders of my ever-growing debt in my ear. To keep the cash flow positive, I started making compromises. I cut back on staffing, which meant I had to be there even more. I delayed equipment maintenance. I started running desperate, deep discount promotions that devalued my own brand and attracted members who were only loyal to the lowest price. Each compromise felt like a small tear in the fabric of my original dream. I was becoming the very thing I had set out to destroy, a gym owner who cared more about the bottom line than the people. My health continued its steady decline. The anxiety was no longer a background hum. It was a roaring static that made it impossible to think clearly. I started having panic attacks. The first one happened late one night while I was trying to make sense of a pile of unpaid invoices. My heart started pounding, the room began to spin, and a crushing weight settled on my chest. I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack. I collapsed on the floor of my office, gasping for air, convinced I was about to die alone in my failing temple of health. The attack subsided, leaving me shaky and drenched in sweat, but it left a scar. The fear of it happening again became a new source of stress, a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. I didn't tell my wife. How could I? I was supposed to be the rock, the strong one. Admitting to a panic attack felt like admitting I was broken, that I couldn't handle the pressure. It was a confession of weakness I wasn't prepared to make. So I kept it a secret, another heavy stone added to the crushing weight on my shoulders. The physical symptoms multiplied. I developed chronic insomnia, my mind racing with financial worries the moment my head hit the pillow. I'd get maybe 2 or 3 hours of broken, nightmare-filled sleep a night. The exhaustion was bone-deep, a cellular fatigue that no amount of caffeine could touch. I was a walking zombie, irritable and emotionally volatile. My relationship with my wife became a minefield. She would try to talk to me, to reach me, but I was unreachable, locked inside the prison of my own stress. Her concern, which came from a place of love, sounded like criticism to my frayed nerves. "You look terrible," she'd say, and I'd hear, "You're failing." "Maybe we should cut our losses," she'd suggest, and I'd hear, "I don't believe in you." The arguments were awful. I'd say things I didn't mean, driven by a fear and a rage that I didn't understand. I was pushing away the one person who was trying to save me. I was so obsessed with saving the business that I didn't see I was destroying my marriage in the process. I started making increasingly reckless financial decisions. I took out a high-interest line of credit from a predatory online lender just to make payroll one month. The interest rates were criminal, a financial quicksand that pulled me deeper into the hole. I was no longer building a business. I was just servicing debt. The entire operation was a house of cards, and the slightest breeze would bring it all crashing down. My kids started to notice the change in me. I was a ghost in their lives, a perpetually stressed-out figure who would snap at them for making too much noise. My daughter once drew a picture of our family. She drew my wife, herself, and her brother smiling under a bright yellow sun. Off to the side, she drew a small, gray figure with a frown. "That's you, Daddy," she said. "You're always at your work." The drawing was like a punch to the gut. It was a child's simple, honest rendering of my catastrophic failure as a father, but even that wasn't enough to make me stop. The dream had its hooks in me too deep. To let go now would be to admit that all the sacrifice, the money, the time, the health, the damage to my family had been for nothing. My ego couldn't accept that. I believed I could still turn it around. I just had to work harder. I just had to push through. I started to experience severe stomach pains. It was a burning, gnawing pain that would double me over. I lived on antacids, but they barely touched the sides. I was losing weight, not in a healthy, athletic way, but in a gaunt, sickly way. My face was pale and drawn. The light in my eyes had gone out. One afternoon, a long-time member, a doctor, took me aside. He looked at me with a practiced clinical concern. "I'm not trying to overstep," he said gently, "but you look like hell. Are you okay?" I gave him my standard answer, the one I gave my wife, the one I gave myself. "I'm fine, just tired. Busy, you know." He just shook his head. "Tired doesn't look like that. You need to see someone. You're running on fumes, and eventually the engine is going to seize." I brushed off his concern, but his words echoed in my mind. The engine is going to seize. I knew he was right. I could feel it. I could feel my body, my fortress, crumbling, the foundations cracking under a siege of my own making. But I was trapped. I had invested everything, not just my money, but my identity, into this gym. If Synergy Fitness failed, then I was a failure. It was as simple and as devastating as that. The choice was no longer between success and failure. It was between keeping this dream on life support and my own survival. And in my deluded, exhausted, and terrified state, I was still choosing the dream. I was willing to let the engine seize, to go down with the ship, because I couldn't imagine a life after its sinking. The crash, when it came, wasn't a slow burn. It was an explosion. It happened on a Thursday. I remember the fluorescent lights of the gym seemed unusually harsh. The familiar smell of chalk and sweat felt suffocating. I was in the middle of a personal training session with a new client, trying to project an aura of calm, confident expertise that I was a million miles away from feeling. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The floor seemed to tilt, and the edges of my vision went blurry and dark. A sharp, searing pain, like a hot knife, stabbed through my stomach and radiated up into my chest. This was different from the panic attacks. This was a deeper, more physical agony. I dropped the clipboard I was holding, its clatter on the rubber floor sounding impossibly loud. I doubled over, clutching my stomach, a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. The last thing I remember is the look of alarm on my client's face before the world dissolved into blackness. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a machine and the sterile smell of antiseptic. A thin, scratchy blanket was pulled up to my chin. An IV tube was taped to the back of my hand. The fluorescent lights here were even harsher than the ones at the gym. I was in a hospital. My wife was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. When she saw my eyes were open, a wave of relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by an anger born of sheer terror. "You idiot," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You absolute stubborn idiot." A doctor came in, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes. She explained what had happened. I hadn't had a heart attack. I had a perforated, bleeding ulcer. The stress and the terrible diet had literally burned a hole through my stomach lining. I had been bleeding internally for some time. If my client hadn't called an ambulance immediately, the doctor said I might not have made it. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. I had almost died. Not in some heroic, noble way, but in a dirty gym office because of a business that was already failing. The absurdity of it was staggering. Lying in that hospital bed, stripped of my identity as a gym owner, a trainer, a strong man, I was forced to confront the truth. The doctor's parting words were a death sentence for my dream. "I can patch you up," she said, her expression serious. "But if you go back to the lifestyle that brought you here, you'll be back. And you might not be so lucky next time. Your business or your life, you need to choose." There was no choice, not really. Staring at the ceiling of that hospital room, listening to the beep of the heart monitor that was tracking my fragile existence, I finally understood. The dream was toxic. It had demanded my money, my time, my family, and now it had come for my life. It was a dream that had turned into a monster, and it was eating me alive. I had to let it go. The recovery was slow and painful. I spent a week in the hospital, and when I was finally discharged, I was a shadow of my former self. I was weak, frail, and on a strict diet of bland, boring foods. The simple act of walking from the bedroom to the kitchen left me winded. My fortress was in ruins. While I was recovering, my wife, my practical, strong wife, became the general of our retreat. She was the one who made the phone calls. She was the one who met with the bankruptcy lawyer. She was the one who arranged the liquidation of the gym's assets. I was too weak, too broken to do it myself. I was a passenger in the dismantling of my own life. Every update she gave me was another nail in the coffin of Synergy Fitness. The equipment was sold for a fraction of its value. We had to break the lease, incurring a massive penalty. The final numbers were catastrophic. Not only had we lost our entire life savings, but we were left with a mountain of personal debt from the loans I had signed for, a debt so large it felt like a life sentence. The day I was finally strong enough to go to the gym one last time, to collect a few personal items before the new owners took over, was one of the hardest days of my life. The space was empty, stripped of the equipment that had been its heart and soul. All that was left were the ghosts of my ambition. I walked through the silent rooms, my hand trailing along the wall that I had painted myself. This place had been my entire world. It had been the source of my greatest pride and my most profound failure. It had given me a purpose, and it had nearly killed me. As I stood in the middle of the empty floor, I didn't feel sadness or anger. I just felt relief, a profound, bone-deep sense of relief. The battle was over. I had lost, but I had survived. And for the first time in years, I felt the crushing weight of the business lift from my shoulders. I was no longer a gym owner. I was just a man. A broke, sick man, but a man who was still alive. A man who had a family that, despite everything, was still waiting for him. I left my keys on the front counter, took one last look at the empty space, and walked out the door without looking back. The dream was dead. The long, difficult process of learning how to live again was just beginning. Coming home from the hospital was like starting life over as a fragile, newborn version of myself. My wife became my caregiver, a role she accepted with a grace I did not deserve. She measured out my medications, prepared my bland meals, and forced me to rest when my stubborn pride told me I should be doing something, anything, to fix the financial wreckage I had created. For the first time in our marriage, I was completely dependent on her, and in that vulnerability, a new kind of intimacy began to grow. The silence between us, which had been born of anger and resentment, was replaced by a quiet understanding. We didn't talk much about the gym or the money. There was nothing left to say. Instead, we talked about small things. The kids' school day, a bird at the feeder outside the window. The past was a minefield we both tacitly agreed not to walk through, not yet. The first priority was healing. My recovery was not just physical. The ulcer would heal, but the anxiety, the years of accumulated stress had left deep grooves in my psyche. I had to learn to be still, to be quiet. My mind, so used to racing at a frantic pace, rebelled against the stillness. I started meditating, not because I was spiritual, but because I was desperate. I'd sit for just 5 minutes at a time, focusing on my breath, trying to tame the frantic, panicked thoughts. It was the hardest workout I had ever done. I also had to redefine my relationship with strength. I had always equated strength with physical power, with pushing through pain, with enduring hardship. Now I was learning that true strength was something else entirely. It was the strength to admit weakness, the strength to ask for help, the strength to surrender. It was the strength to choose a quiet, simple life over a loud, ambitious dream. The financial reality was brutal. Bankruptcy loomed, a constant, humiliating presence. We had to sell our house. The home where we had brought our children from the hospital, the home filled with the ghosts of a happier time. Watching the "for sale" sign go up on the front lawn was a special kind of agony. It was a public declaration of our failure. We moved into a small, cramped rental apartment on the other side of town. Downsizing our lives so drastically was a lesson in humility. We sold furniture, clothes, electronics, anything that wasn't essential. And in shedding the layers of our material life, we discovered a strange sense of lightness. We were no longer defined by our possessions. We were just a family huddled together in a small apartment, trying to build a new life from the rubble of the old one. Once I was physically able, I had to find a job. My resume was a joke. A decade of steady but unremarkable corporate work, followed by a massive, fiery crater labeled failed business owner. No one wanted to hire a man who had orchestrated such a spectacular financial disaster. After dozens of rejections, I took the only job I could get, working the early morning shift at a large home improvement store, stocking shelves. I would wake up at 3 a.m., put on the bright orange apron, and spend 5 hours lifting boxes and organizing merchandise in the cavernous, silent store before the customers arrived. It was mindless physical work, and in a strange way, it was exactly what I needed. It was low stress. There were no life-altering decisions to be made. I just had to put the right box in the right place, and when my shift was over, I could go home and leave the job behind me. I was no longer a CEO, an owner, or a brand. I was just a man who stocked shelves, and in that anonymity I found peace. Slowly, life found a new rhythm. My health improved. The color returned to my face. The tremor in my hands subsided. My wife and I, having navigated the absolute worst a couple can go through, found our way back to each other. We had to rebuild our trust, our communication from the ground up. We learned to talk, really talk, about our fears and our hopes. We were partners, forged into a stronger unit by the fire that had almost consumed us. I started to reconnect with my children, making up for the lost time when the gym had been my priority. I coached my son's baseball team. I helped my daughter with her science projects. I was present fully and completely. I found joy not in building a business empire, but in the small, sacred moments of fatherhood. One afternoon, years later, I was in the park with my family. I was throwing a baseball with my son, my wife and daughter laughing on a nearby blanket. I felt a sense of contentment so profound it almost brought me to tears. I was not rich. I was not a business owner. I lived in a small rental apartment and stocked shelves for a living. By every metric of my old life, I was a failure, but I was healthy. My stomach didn't burn. My heart didn't race with anxiety. I was in love with my wife. My children knew who their father was. The sun was warm on my face, and the sound of my family's laughter was the only soundtrack I ever needed. My dream had cost me my money and nearly cost me my health and my family. But the failure of that dream had given me something far more valuable in return. A second chance at a life. A real life. Not a life based on ambition or ego or the relentless pursuit of more, but a life based on the simple, quiet, and profound joy of being present for the people you love. I had to lose everything to realize what truly mattered. And for that, in a strange and painful way, I will be forever grateful. Thanks for staying with me until the end. Stories like these always make us think about our own lives and choices. What lesson did this bring to your mind? Share your personal experience or perspective in the comments. You never know who might need to read exactly what you have to say today.